Okay, I think this is working, but I got to now post the link to this. There should be a share button somewhere in there. I'll just copy and paste the link like that. Okay, so far nobody's found this new link. Oh, somebody tells me the new link is also not working.
It's frustrating, dude.
Uh,
I have Zoom. If you want to create a link and send it to their chat,
okay. Hmm. No, here's a this. This damn YouTube, they make everything so bloody opaque. I found the how to get it working. Then this should maybe work. Come on. How do I kill this stream? I don't see a. This is not working. It doesn't have a kill switch. Oh, this is so bloody cumbersome. Uh, I just close the tab, it probably won't kill the screen, will it?
Mm.
Won't kill the stream. Maybe I don't see anything else I can do.
There's this thing called Zoom. I have a.
Yeah, yeah, I know about Zoom. No, okay. It looks like,
Worked.
yeah. Okay. Is it working now? I see there's 5 people on. Yeah, I killed that other stream. So can you hear me? Is the audio getting through? Yes, good. Okay. So we're back in business. Okay, I'll just wait a minute or two as still people popping in. Sorry about that. At the last minute, we tried plugging the external light into one of the ports on the computer and to get uh, powered up again, and that crashed the whole thing. So we now got 8 people, and we had 15 before when the last I looked when it crashed. So I'll wait a couple more minutes and see if anybody comes in. Otherwise, we'll start. Okay, so a couple more people jumped in. Okay, good. Okay, I think I'll start now. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, my apologies for the technical uh, snafus, but we're on now, and we're going. So today I've decided to talk on the historical context of the Buddha, putting the Buddha into that context. And there's a couple of preliminary remarks I'd like to make. One is first that the Buddha's teaching is akaliko, that is timeless, and that's a word that has a multivalence to it. It means it can be interpreted on different levels. Uh, but certainly one of the meanings of akaliko is that the teachings are um, useful and significant and true for every generation of human beings, from ancient India down to the present day. That the basic problems of birth, old age, sickness, and death are still with us, and the path to awakening is still the same. Um, the basic fundamentals don't change in the human situation. But on the other hand, and another thing to uh, be aware of is that the Buddha, as a human being, as a historical person, he did live at a specific time and place, in a specific culture, in a specific moment, in a ongoing history, and his teachings are better understood if we can place him in that context. One of the um, errors that I see from time to time amongst modern people is to assume that their present cultural situation is the normal or the natural. And with one of the results of this is to um, anachronistically reinterpret the Buddha's teaching through a modern lens, to push modern ideas back into the Buddha and the Buddha's time. And this leads to some subtle misunderstandings and confusion, I think. So we have to, um, when we're studying the suttas, we're studying the scriptures, we uh, will understand them better if we're trying to put ourselves into the mindset of an ancient Indian listening to these discourses. The Sutta Pitaka records actual discourses of the Buddha that were given to real people and a wide variety and range of people. And very often the framing story of the sutta will tell you, where he was speaking and to whom. That can help you to better interpret the teaching. So it's useful to have some general picture of the society in which the Buddha lived. Of course, as we know, the Buddha lived and taught in India, mostly in the Ganges Valley. This is what was called the Majjhima Padesa, the middle country. And this is a very specific um, location with a very specific culture and history. India has always been, and even down to the present day, has been a very multifaceted society. There are many, many different languages, different ethnic groups, different religions. It's a very complex region of the world. It's sometimes called the subcontinent because it is really a world unto itself in many ways. And the moment the Buddha taught, the historical moment the Buddha taught, was a specific one of transition. If we go back in time, before the Buddha, let's set the stage. If we go far enough back, the first advanced civilized culture in India was in the Indus Valley, the um, culture that modern archaeologists call the Harappan culture, after one of the major cities. This culture we don't know a lot about because we've never deciphered their writing system, so we don't have any written history of them. And later generations in India had totally forgotten about this culture. It was only rediscovered in the early 20th century. But they were roughly the contemporaries to Mesopotamia. They had trade with Mesopotamia. They had uh, large cities that were quite remarkable in some ways for their time, in that they were laid out in a very square grid, and they had advanced water system. They had running water in most of the buildings. They seem to have been, and we can infer from the archaeological evidence that the society was probably more egalitarian or had a flatter kind of hierarchy than many other societies, in that uh, the difference in size between the largest houses and the smallest houses was not very great. It was a agricultural civilization. The Indus Valley was much more fertile then than it became later. they seem to come to some kind of crisis and collapse, which may have been ecological. They may have, as many other early cultures did, they may have exhausted their own ecological base, and the agricultural base no longer supported the population. So the cities were already in decline when um, the next wave of peoples came into India, and these were the Aryans. This was a very uh, vigorous race of people that came out of somewhere in Central Asia. It's debatable where they came from, maybe somewhere in like modern Kazakhstan, Caspian Sea area. And they had early on mastered some technologies that gave them a military edge over other people. They domesticated the horse and they used metal weapons, first bronze and later iron. And they spread all over westward into Europe and uh, southeast into India and Iran. The Iranians, in their scriptures, the Zoroastrian scriptures, they record that these people came originally from the far north, and it was climate change that drove them out. When it got cold and the Arctic conditions drove them south. But in any case, they came into India and they finished off what was left of the Harappan culture, which was already in decline. And at the period when the Aryans um, emerged into India, they were at a level of culture we could call barbaric. They were um, nomadic. They had herds of cattle and they rode horses, and they were very warlike. They fought against the previous inhabitants and also against each other. This is equivalent to, say, the Homeric period in Greece, which and the ancient Greeks were also originally in one of these Aryan groups. And they pushed through into India, and they had the scriptures of the Vedas, um, and then they had their culture. They had, it seems, already before, as they first came into India, they already took with them a caste system of three castes: a warrior caste, a priest caste, and the cattle herders, which was originally simply an occupational division. Uh, and then as they moved into India, they conquered the existing peoples and consigned them to a fourth and lower caste, the Sudras. And after passing through the Indus Valley, they began moving up the Ganges Valley, and that was a much more difficult passage because of the landscape and climate. It was jungle at the time, thick jungle, and it was malarial, so it wasn't so benign as the Indus Valley. Some scholars have said that one of the early gods of the Vedic people was Agni, was very important, the god of fire, because they probably, as they advanced slowly, generation by generation, up the Ganges, they burnt out the jungle, and fire was like the great cleanser that opened the land for agriculture. And the people they encountered here were at a much more primitive cultural level, probably at a kind of Neolithic level. But the Aryans imposed themselves as a ruling caste over the others, and gradually over time they settled down and became agriculturalists and built cities. And by the time of the Buddha, which was um, roughly the 5th century BC, they had already settled, the heroic age was over, and they had a settled civilization based on um, rice growing agriculture and also other crops. Uh, Rice became increasingly important as they went east. The climate was more suitable for rice than for wheat and barley, which they probably originally grew. And the cattle raising was declining in importance relative to uh, grain agriculture. And it must have been, the agriculture must have been lucrative enough to support a large surplus to maintain large cities, because we know of many large cities in that area of the Ganges. Culturally, they um, were still organized into this four caste system. These are the four varnas. This was not as rigid and as stratified as it later became in India, when you had a multiplication of subcastes and very complicated rules about who you could eat with and who you could marry and so forth. This time it was pretty much just an occupational division of into four: the warrior caste, the Katyas, the Brahmans, the priestly caste, the uh, the Vesas, who originally had been the cattle herders, but by this time they were becoming the merchant class, the mercantile class, and the Sudas, or the workers, the common people. And there was also the emergence of an even lower group, the Chandalas, or outcasts. There were people who did dirty work like leather work or clearing rubbish. They were considered outcasts because the Indian culture, from earliest times, as we can see from the water systems in Harappa down to even the present, they put a great stress on ritual purity and uh, bodily cleanliness. So someone who has to work in unclean occupations is kept on the outskirts of society. Uh, Politically, they were organized at this time mostly into kingdoms, and there were traditionally considered to be 16 great kingdoms in northern India at the time, Mahajanapadas. If we They were geographically quite small, really, if you can fit like 16 of them into the Ganges Valley. And there were also some republics. And it seems like the republics were the older form of government, closer to the original Aryan Vedic period way of governance. And when we say republic, we should not think of them as modern republics, or certainly not as democracies. They were more like the heads of the clans they didn't have one overall ruler, but the heads of the clans would get together in council and make decisions. The Buddha himself was born Siddhartha Gautama in a small state in the far north of the cultural region, actually outside of the Ganges Valley, in the foothills of the Himalayas, up by modern Nepal, uh, the Sakyan Republic. Later accounts of the Buddha's life always make him a prince, the son of the king. That seems to be an exaggeration, because Sakya was a republic. They wouldn't have had a king. But he does, in the sutta, the Buddha does say that he was raised in great wealth and luxury and ease. So his father was certainly powerful, one of the aristocrats of this Sakyan area. And The Buddha self-identifies in several places as being of the Khattiya or warrior caste. um, so he was of the upper class of his group, his society, um, in Sakya. But most of his career as uh, the Buddha, as a teacher, was carried out in the Ganges Valley, in the more settled and advanced region of India at the time. This was a period of flux and change. We see that after the Buddha, the kingdoms in the next few generations, they fighting various wars, they consolidated, and we had the emergence of the Aryan Empire, which culminated in Ashoka, which dominated almost the whole of the Indian subcontinent. But at the time of the Buddha, it was still divided into various small kingdoms. The kingdoms would be ruled by a Raja, a king, and they're described in the stories, in the suttas and commentaries, as being very wealthy and having a great many luxuries. The the military, and they fought a lot of wars between each other. The military was divided into the fourfold groups: the infantry, the cavalry, the chariots, and the elephants. And this is the four. You'll see it referred to in the suttas as the fourfold army of the king. And this is the origin of the game of chess. You have the king and the queen were originally the Raja and the Purohita. That is the leader of the king, who was the leader of the Khattiyan class, the warrior class, and the Purohita is the leader of the Brahmans. Who would always, the king always ruled with a Purohita, so it was like a dual power. The king was on top, but his right hand man was always a Brahmin, and the infantry are the pawns, of course, and the chariots are the bishops. We only call them bishops in English, as most other countries have different names for them. Um, and the rooks are the elephants. India was a very precocious civilization intellectually. Um, very much, although on a different theme, a different kind of approach, very much like Greece. And people who've had in Western countries who've had a European education, European style education, will have probably a good knowledge of Greece and see Greece as the origin of our culture and our thought. But India was quite as um, prolific in intellectual work and philosophy as Greece. But there was a different cultural tone with the thought and the philosophies, in that Greece was always more extroverted. Greeks were always looking out, trying to figure out the world, whereas the Indians were looking inwards, trying to figure out the mind and trying to find liberation. This is very much a different cultural tone and emphasis of what's important. There was a wide variety of philosophies and religions in India already at the Buddha's time. The orthodox religion, the dominant religion, was what modern scholars generally call Brahmanism. It's an anachronism to call it Hinduism. Hinduism is the later development out of all these early trends. That Brahmanism took its basis in the Vedas, And the Vedas uh, largely center around ritual and particularly sacrifice. This was a very central theme of the Vedic religion was the minute ritual details of performing a sacrifice. And the Brahmin caste were the specialists who could perform the sacrifices. And it came to be uh, believed that the gods were actually compelled by the sacrifice. That if you performed a sacrifice correctly and you were trying to get fertility for your fields or uh, cure from a disease or some worldly aim like that, and you had the Brahmins come in and they did a ceremony and a sacrifice, the gods would have to give you the result you wanted. If that failed to materialize, it only meant that the Brahmins had made a mistake, that they confused the chanting or they didn't do the right gestures or something. Um, and you'll see in the suttas, you'll see very often a reference to the holy men of the time as being. They'll use a compound phrase, um, Samanas and Brahmins, and this was the two main types of religion. The Brahmins were part of the Aryan caste system. They came in with the Aryans, but the Samanas, and the word is cognate to the word shaman. It has the same root. They were this. This was a religious trend that came from the pre-Aryan people of India. The Samanas were um, religious seekers of much less organized than the Brahmins. They didn't have such a hierarchy or a ritual structure. There were individual seekers who would go into the forest and practice austerities generally with the aim of attaining superior states of mind. Originally, it was very much like shamans in a more primitive culture, but by the Buddhist time, they had evolved some schools, some more or less organized schools of samanas. The Buddha teaching itself, the sasana and the sangha, are often called samanas. A young monk is a samanera, which means like a little samana. So the Buddha himself, in his teaching and his system that he set up, kind of merged the two streams of Indian history. The Aryan side is present in the organization and the discipline and the use of the word Aryan, which is Aryan. It came to by the Buddhist time that word came to mean noble. It no longer really had an ethnic implication. It meant like the noble class. They were the Aryans. So the Katyans and Brahmins were considered the Aryans. And the Buddha uses that word. We have the four noble truths. They are the four Aryan truths, Satya Araya. Um, and the Buddha himself was of that lineage. So he had that, there was that stream, but he also tapped into the older stream in India of the samanas, the seekers. That's what the bhikkhus actually are, seekers of higher wisdom and of liberation, and not ritual priests like the Brahmins, but seekers of higher states of wisdom and liberation. So there were these two uh, impulses from the depths of Indian history, that the Brahmans and the Samanas that were active in the Buddhist time, and the Buddha, one of his attributes or contributions of his particular system, I think, was more or less a merging of these two streams. India at the time was also very much in a period of change. All of history, we could say, is periods of change, but there are certainly certain periods where the change is more rapid. I think we're living in one now. And ancient India at the time of the Buddha was going through transformation on many different levels. One we've already touched on is the political level, where the republics were dying out. The last of the republics were being overthrown during the Buddha's lifetime and taken over by the monarchies. And then the monarchies coalesced after the Buddha into a single empire. But also on a technological level, this was a period of change. That before, in the period shortly before the Buddha, um, some new technologies were being introduced that that were changing society, and particularly two. One is money. The use of currency allows for a much more sophisticated economy than a simple barter economy. So it also allows international or national and international trade to increase, and that brings in new intellectual currents and uh, changes a lot of things in society. For example, the Buddha's critique of the caste system, he criticized the Brahmins who taught that the caste system was divinely ordained from the beginning. It was like a um, original original with the creation of the world, and it came from the gods. The Buddhists said no, it's a human convention. And one of the arguments he used to advance this idea was look at the Ionas, he said. The Ionas meaning the Greeks. It comes from the word Ionian. He said, look at the Ionas. They only have two castes, slave and free. So that the caste system is not the same everywhere. It's not universal. It's not a fixed thing. It's a human convention. Once a culture begins to contact other cultures, then things get shaken up. And that was beginning to happen in India, as well as with the money economy. You also get more trade and more production and a higher standard of living. And the Indians at the time do seem to have had a pretty good standard of living. And the agriculturalists, the farmers, were generally, we think from all the evidence, that they were generally free. There wasn't a large scale agricultural slavery like there was in Rome later, for example. It seems like the farmers that were either tenant farmers or small proprietors, but they were personally free. Um, the other technology that was beginning at the time was um, writing. Writing at the Buddhist time was very little known, and may have been only used by merchants for keeping accounts and kings for sending diplomatic messages. There was certainly no writing down of scriptures and so on. But this was something that was writing was something that was just beginning in India, written language. And of course, after the Buddha's time, it became very important. There's a, a thesis that some academic writer who I can't recall his name, I'm sorry, but it was an article I read recently that said that both the Mahayana and the Abhidhamma, which both became known around the same time, which would have been, roughly the first century BC, you know, a bit less than 300 years after the Buddha, the were only made possible by the widespread use of writing for different reasons. The Mahayana, as a heterodox set of doctrines, could not be propagated as long as the scriptures were oral. There's no possible way you could get when they were preserved as they were for the first few hundred years, they were preserved orally by monks chanting together. So you have monks that learn the Digha Nikaya and they go through in the course of the year, they chant different suttas and that preserves, and they do it in groups. So that's self-correcting because if someone makes a mistake, he hears everyone else and corrects. So you can't have some guy just come wander in and say, "Well, I got this new one, the Lotus Sutra. We're going to go with that." No, that wouldn't work. But once you have writing, you can just write them down and make copies and distribute them. And the Abhidhamma uh, needs writing for a different reason. The Abhidhamma is very hard to present and remember when it's just presented orally. You really, if you look at any books on Abhidhamma, you'll see tables and charts cross-referencing things, and you really need to be able to have a written text that you can go backwards and forwards and cross-reference. So writing is a bit after the Buddha's time when it really became important for the religion, but it certainly had its effect. And it was just beginning in India at the Buddha's time. So we have to, this is a general picture. We have to remember that the Buddha he was the perfectly enlightened one, Sama Sambuddha, but he was also a human being in the flesh who lived at a certain time and place and taught within a certain context to listeners who had a certain history and a certain culture. There's a saying from the Zen teacher Dogen, talking about the Buddha. He said, "If you see the Tathagata, do you see the old man Shakyamuni? And if you see the old man Shakyamuni, do you see the Tathagata?" This is to say that we should, for a complete appreciation of the Buddha, we need to see both aspects. We need to see him as Sama Sambuddha, as the fully enlightened one, awakened by his own efforts. Uh, but we also need to see him as a living human being who was born to a wealthy family on the edge, the edge of the cultural, sort of the backwoods, boonies of the cultural field of Vedic India, and made it in the big city, so to speak, and taught in the more culturally advanced regions, and eventually died as an old man at the age of 80 with dysentery and backache. Now, these are the two sides that have to be remembered. So I think I'll stop there, and as usual, I'll stay on and answer questions that pop up in the chat. And I see there's a few, looks like there's a few things in the chat already. I try not to read the chat while I'm talking, then I lose my train of thought. But I'll look at it now. Somebody's asking about asking why the Buddha taught the 31 planes of existence, which seem to include pre-Dhamma viewpoints such as the Brahma realm. Yeah, well, this is also part of what I'm saying, that the Buddha lived in ancient India, and 31 planes of existence, some variant was part of the general mind of, and we shouldn't be anachronistic and try and impose our modern ideas on the Buddhist time and the Buddhist teaching. Would you say that Buddhism arose in India because of the amount and variety of spiritual experimentation that the Indians didn't continue to do? If we were to think of this in terms of probability, yes, I think there's something to that. That according to the account in the commentaries of the Buddha um, taking birth, when he was in his previous birth, he had completed all the baramis in his last human birth as King Vasantara, and then he spent a long lifetime in Tusita heaven as a Dewa, waiting for um, conditions to be right on the earth for him to take birth as a Buddha. And he decided this is the right time and place. Now I will take birth, and it certainly was a suitable place for him to be born, um, because of the widespread philosophical flux in India and the high regard that that culture had for holy men and teachers. Just compare the the life and career of the Buddha with that of Jesus Christ, born into the Roman Empire. He was only able to teach for 3 years, and they nailed him up on a cross. Whereas the Buddha was fed and respected and honored by kings and but by all classes of society. So India was a very suitable place, and particularly India at that moment in history was a suitable place for the Buddha to be born. So the Buddha was not known to ever write anything down. Is that correct? Yes. Do you think there is significant difference in effects of hearing versus reading Dhamma teachings? I think there probably is. You're taking in information when you hear it or read it. You're taking it in differently. And you should remember that the suttas were originally oral, and that's why there's so much repetition, which to many modern readers, it can seem boring or off-putting to have so much repetition. It's this kind of standardized ways of phrasing things, but that was necessary for the text to be easily memorized. Did the Buddha take aspects of Hinduism, Brahmanism, Jainism, some concepts like reincarnation and karma as similar? Um, yeah, well, reincarnation, for example, let's take that. That was already, the idea of reincarnation was already prevalent in India. It wasn't universal because remember, there were different philosophers had different ideas. Um, it doesn't seem to have been an original part of the Vedic religion. If we go far enough back, there was an idea of being reborn into not a continual rebirth, but to go to the land of the dead and be an ancestor and be worshipped as an ancestor. But by the Buddhist time, the idea of reincarnation was very prevalent. It was a dominant idea. Um, the Buddha changed it with his denial of self, the uh, rejection of the self idea is his most radical innovation in terms of philosophy. So that generally in English now, Buddhists will don't say reincarnation; they say rebirth, because there is nothing that gets reincarnated, right? But there's a re-arising of consciousness to like conditions. Uh, would you say that Jesus was a once returner? Um, no, no. I would have a hard time saying that. He may have been a bodhisattva, but I couldn't see him as being a once returner. And I'll say this reason why: because a once returner will have overcome anger. And in the Gospels, there are two instances where Jesus displays anger. One is the money changers in the temple, and the other is the when he blasted the fig tree, which seems quite almost a petulant display of anger. He, um, so he demonstrated that he had these mind states that shouldn't arise in a once returner. Should the descriptions of the Buddha's appearance be taken literally, like having black hair, blue eyes, long fingers, etc.? Yeah, that's a pretty decent question. I don't know. I leave that kind of an open question because um, if we take the 32 marks of the great man, which is actually adapted from pre-Buddhist ideas, they're marks, and some of them are quite outlandish, really. If he actually had these features, like uh, arms that are so long that he could, his hands were hung down below his knees, and um, completely flat feet, and it was kind of strange things. Um, so it's I don't know. I personally have a little hard time believing he had these particular features, but leave it kind of an open question. Is there any connection between Gautama and prior Buddhas? Did they all teach the Dhamma? Yes, that there is a linkage between Buddhas, not between every Buddha, but there is a lineage in that one of the attributes of a Buddha is that he has to be recognized or blessed at the beginning of his bodhisattva career by a previous Buddha at some time in the very remote past. In the case of Gautama Buddha, he was recognized by Dipankara Buddha, I think it was 92 kappas ago. So an unbelievably long period of time in the past. But this is always the beginning of a Buddha's career. But then in between Buddhas, like in this world system, there's going to be five Buddhas. We've had four. There's one to come. The There's a period in between Buddhas when the teaching is completely forgotten, and there's no possibility of a Buddha arising while the previous Buddhist teachings are still remembered. So there's no direct connection that way. Uh, so he was not a student of prior Buddha. Oh, he was blessed by Dipankara. So at that time, he had heard Dipankara teaching. So at a very remote time in the past, he did hear teachings from a previous Buddha.
It's 7 o'clock.
According to the Sri Lankans, the Buddha visited Sri Lanka several spots are now pilgrimage sites. Why is this not mentioned in the Pali Canon? Um, because I'll give a kind of a, maybe I'll upset some people to say this, but it's not mentioned in the Pali Canon because it's really entirely legendary. I don't I don't think it's because all the Buddhist countries, the Theravada countries, Burma and Thailand, they also have similar legends that the Buddha visited them. I don't think it's really very likely that he did. Again, I would say it's not absolutely impossible. He's the Buddha. He could do things we can't imagine, but there's no record of that occurring in the Pali Canon or in any Indian text. It's entirely a Sri Lankan legend, and the Sinhala people weren't even in Sri Lanka at the time of the Buddha. Was it forbidden to record the appearance of the Buddha, Nirmanakaya? If so, why? Was it because his teachings were more geared toward realization of the Dharmakaya? 32 marks refer to which body? The what this questioner is referring to is Dharmakaya. That's a term from Tibetan Buddhism. You don't find that in the Theravada system. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are three bodies of the Buddha: Nirmanakaya, which is the physical body; Sambhogakaya, which we could say is like the archetypal body; and the Dhammakaya, which is the ultimate or transcendent body. And the reference at the beginning of your question, was it forbidden to record the appearance of the Buddha's Nirmanakaya? It was actually a custom it wasn't an injunction directly from the Buddha, but it was a custom that was actually quite strong. It developed in India after the Buddha's time, not to represent the Buddha in art. There were, for the first several generations, there were carvings and paintings and things that showed scenes from the life of the Buddha, but they would leave the Buddha out and just represent him by maybe a parasol hanging in space where the Buddha was standing underneath. It was considered disrespectful to try and represent the image of the Buddha. It's very likely that the first Buddha images actually came from the Greeks, from the Bactrian, the kingdoms that were set up after Alexander the Great in what's now Afghanistan, Pakistan area. They were very likely the first Buddha images. Is it an awareness that passes from one life to the next? No, there's nothing that passes from one life to the next. There's a re-arising of consciousness. Didn't he study with Kassapa as Kotapala? No, he wouldn't have. I'd have to look that up. I don't recognize that. Oh, Jyotipala. Jyotipala, previous birth of the Buddha, as he was a layman in the time of Kassapa Buddha. Yeah, so I suppose, yeah, that's true. That is the story. Why do modern Hindus consider the Buddha to be a reincarnation of Vishnu? Well, they want to, incorporate him into their system. And Vishnu had these, in the Hindu system, Vishnu has all these different avatars through time, and they incorporate the Buddha as one of the avatars of Vishnu. In Mahayana, a bodhisattva is one who was not attached to arahanthood. It is a mysterious paradox. Yeah. I always see that there's a dynamic between the Theravada and Mahayana understandings of these things. A Mahayana critique of Theravada could say that the Theravada goal of arahantship is narrow and selfish for self-liberation only. But then the Theravada look at the Mahayana and say, well, you kind of want your cake and eat it too. You're not ready to renounce, transcend existence. You're attached to becoming. So you invent this bodhisattva goal to make it sound lofty. Would you say that modern archaeologists neglect ancient Indian history at the time of the Buddha, or is it just the structures that were built during that time of the Buddha were not preservable? There's actually quite a lot of archaeology been done in India, um, and there are, we have fairly good archaeological evidence of things, but it would be the case in in the Ganges Valley region that the preservation of artifacts is not good because of the climate and the geography. So only really stone structures we would have. Even metal tends to rust out, and the iron that they used at the time was of a poor quality compared to later. If there's nothing that passes from one life to the next, is there any significance to past life memories? There could be. That is one of the psychic powers that one remembers one previous lifetimes. That doesn't require any transmission of substance. In Vimalakirti Sutra, Vimalakirti was an extravagant, and he was criticizing Shariputta, who was perfect arahant. It seems paradoxical. It's better that we see Theravada and Mahayana together. Yes, a statement, not a question. Is there some kind of origin story for the design of the Buddha and his Sangha robes? Yeah, there is some story to that. The first thing to understand is that the shape and cut of the robe is not special for the Sangha at the time. That was basically how everybody dressed. This is ordinary streetwear for ancient Magadhan, except that their robes would be colorful. They would be decorated or bright colors, party kind of colors, whereas the monks wore humble colors. But there is a special sewing technique that I probably can't show you. It won't show up on the camera, but there's stitches in the robe that make a pattern that they call them in Thai. I'm not sure what they actually are in Pali. I should know, but I remember the Thai name is Kusi, and the Kusis are a very specific pattern. And there's a story that I think it was Ananda asked the Buddha, "How should we sew our robes?" And he said, "Like the rice fields of Magadha." Uh, so the rice fields in a wet rice agriculture, they have dikes all over the place in a pattern, and the robes have that like a line and then cross line. Um, and this is a kind of a curious thing that some years ago I went to a conference with Buddhist representatives from many different branches of Buddhism, Japanese and Chinese and Tibetan and Thai and Sri Lankan, and we had one like a workshop comparing our robes, and it was kind of became a surprise to everybody that the colors of the robes are different, the actual cut and the way they're worn are different, but the kusis are the same. Everybody's got these kusis, this rice field of Magadha that's been preserved in all the permutations. Uh, why is it common to say the Buddha was a prince? I think it probably arose because in later generations, India was entirely monarchical and they couldn't imagine really a society without a king. And they wanted to have the story of the Buddha as they elaborated the story of the Buddha's early life, and filled in the details. So, um, it was natural for them to make him a prince. Uh, More questions about Theravada and Mahayana. It's kind of off-topic stuff there. From today's theme, but I'll look at it. What I mean by Theravada wisdom, one realizes nirvana. By Mahayana returns to samsara, realizing is the same as nirvana. That is the Mahayana view. Um, in Theravada, it's more like nibbana and samsara are completely separate, and that one transcends. One's goal is to make an end of samsara, not to return to it. So I think there is a fundamental difference there in between the two branches. Okay, someone just put in that I should ask questions from my live audience. Do you have questions?
You want to go first?
Yes.
Well, you mentioned the Samanas.
Yeah.
Do we know anything about their doctrines?
Yeah, the question was, in case you didn't hear it, he asked me about samanas. What do we know about the doctrines of the samanas? We do have some references to different schools of samanas that had different. There isn't like one unified doctrine. There were uh, the followers of, I'm trying to remember the name of the school. They're the followers that were uh, rigid materialists. There were other ones that were determinists. Um, it seems like was a common theme was uh, a desire to achieve higher states of consciousness by tormenting the body.
Okay. Oh, is that why the Buddha did that for a while?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah. That seemed to have been a theme that many of the different groups had. Or was it Ajivakas was what I'm trying to think of. They were like the materialists, but they also did the same tormenting.
Mhm.
And the Jains were another group like that became like the Buddhists. They became more organized
Right.
and developed a religion that lasted after their time.
Mhm.
But most of the samanas were pretty individualist. They didn't really get organized very well.
Right.
Did you have a question, Danica?
Yes, I just thought of it. Uh, I sometimes read that the Buddha was a materialist and a skeptic.
Yeah.
And my question is then, which were the major philosophical schools at his time, and which was he closest to, so to speak?
Okay. I don't know if people could hear that question. Um, it was that she has heard that the Buddha called a materialist and a skeptic, and if that is that right, and what philosophical schools would he have been closest to? Well, he certainly was not a materialist. Um, Quite definitely, that was one of the views that he denounced as wrong view. Um, a materialist view would not be possible to have any kind of rebirth, and it would also not be possible to have a realization of nibbana. To incorporate that into a materialist view, it doesn't work. Um, he was. I know, calling him skeptical, you'd have to define skeptic. It's not, in some sense, he was, because his teaching was ehipassiko, meaning come and see. It's not a dogmatic teaching. But he wasn't skeptical in the sense of uh,
kind of wanting to break everything down and sort of destructive skepticism. Um, he had some as for what schools he was close to. He probably had the most affinity with some of the Upanishads,
Mhm.
but with the major change that he denied the existence of a self. So the Upanishads were advanced philosophical thought that came out of the Vedic tradition, uh, developed from that, and one of the key philosophical ideas of the Upanishads was that Atman equals Brahma, which means the self, you are God, the self and God are one. And the Buddha said, no, there's no self. So there's no, there's nothing to be identified with. Let's see, got some more questions up here. Oh, let's see, I have a question about great monks who are considered to be arahants, like Ajahn Mun or Mahabua. The thing is, they chewed the betel nut. Yeah. So why would an arahant do something like that? Well, it's not. I don't see why they wouldn't. If they don't suffer, why would they need something like that? Just as a just as a kind of a why drink a cup of tea, or it's just this thing that they do. I don't see how that's a problem. It doesn't show an inherently defiled mind to chew betel nut. There's no difference between a materialist and an essentialist. Wrong concept of Atman, wrong concept of material, the same dualism. Yes, yeah. So it's getting kind of on in time. I think I'll close the stream down pretty soon. If anybody has a last question on topic, I'll deal with it. But
Do we know anything about his son?
he's being asked about the Buddha's son Rahula.
Rahula.
He ordained as a monk and became an arahant eventually. Okay. Okay, I think I'll shut it down now, and I apologize for the technical glitches. Still getting things worked out. I gotta say,
Blame it on me.
I blame it on Danica
Yes,
and
I
on
accept.
and on YouTube.